We can light the world up with a word. We can take a nothing day and brighten it up with a tale unheard. 'Cause we're learning and knowing and growing, with welcoming words overflowing, you know it. Come along with me, let's read together. Come along, let's see what's new together. Come join us in the welcome word. Come join us in the welcome word.
Welcome to Welcome Word. I'm Mary, a librarian at Gethsemane Lutheran Church in Hopkins, and today we're going to be talking about Minnesota authors. Now, fairly soon, now May 2nd, the Minnesota Book Awards will be announced. And so the judges are busy getting ready and reading all the books in their categories. And you might be also very interested to know that Minnesota is in the top 10 of 3 lists. The first list is the most well-read population. The second list is the number of independent bookstores per capita. And the last list is, in the top 10, our Hennepin County Library System. So we in Minnesota love our books, and it's no wonder because we love the authors. Let's meet them. I'm going to begin with the most popular, well-read, enjoyed author in any part of the world from Minnesota is Charles Schulz. I don't have to tell you much about him because you are familiar with him, but he's a real treasure. So I just couldn't leave him out. I ordered 2 books for our library. One happens to be a CD. You know these stories very well. It's The Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, Charlie Brown's Christmas, and we have Charlie Brown's Thanksgiving, all in this packet. And Mr. Schulz has often asked if these characters in his book are from his childhood, and they are. He grew up on Jansen Street. He was born actually in Minneapolis, but spent most of his time in St. Paul. And his father was a barber, his mother was a housewife, and so Charlie Brown's mother and father grew up in that same area, and they were both a barber and a housewife. And then Snoopy is interesting. When Charles was growing up, he had a pointer dog that was black and white and did very odd things. So he incorporated his lifelong pet into Snoopy. The second book goes way back and was printed in 1925. It's very difficult to get now because it's not usually available, but I was lucky to get it. It's called Wild Geese by Martha Ostenso. Martha Ostenso left Norway with her family when she was 2 years old, and they went to Winnipeg in Canada, came into the small prairie towns of North Dakota and Minnesota, and finally she ended up married and lived in Minneapolis, and they spent their summers on Gull Lake. Now she has a very interesting story to tell. There was a competition that was given out to have anyone that could enter, and it was had to be a debut novel. And so Martha thought, oh, well, I'll just write a novel and I'll try and see if I can win the top prize. Well, she did. And she wrote it all in 6 weeks. and this book happens to be Wild Swans. Wild Swans is known as a book of reality. And the reason that is because she really tells what she saw in her culture at the time. The book takes place on a farm. There are two main protagonists. There's Father, Caleb Garth, who is a patriarchal bully, and there's Judith Garth, his oldest daughter, who would love to be able to escape the farm, but it feels guilty about leaving her mother and siblings behind to deal with the father's brutality. So she goes back and forth, and that's where Wild Swans gets its name, because she would look up in the sky and she'd see the wild swans, or she'd see the wild geese flying from one part to the other part. And it can be brutal in some points. It's heartwarming, and it does come for a good ending. Wild Geese was made into a movie in 1940, and it's had 2 adaptations ever since. I think you'll enjoy the book. The next book I have was copyrighted in 1941, called The Chuckling Fingers. It happens to be Minnesota's answer to Agatha Christie. Mabel Seeley wrote 25 mysteries, and they always had a protagonist who was very astute. Many of the times they were single people, often women, and they'd be called into exotic places where, of course, a mystery takes place. It reminds me a lot of Nancy Drew books and what it would be like as a book that when you were reading it and you became older, you might have been a heroine in The Chuckling Fingers. And besides, I love the name Chuckling Fingers. The next book I have from you is recommended by William Kent Kruger. Now, anytime William Kent Kruger recommends a book, I'm all ears. And this one is called Carolina Moonset. It is written by Matt Goldman. Matt Goldman has been a playwright and a writer for such shows, television shows as Seinfeld and Ellen. And he's also written, of course, he's also an author. He lives in Minnesota with his wife, 2 dogs, 2 cats, and whichever children happen to be home. Now, this story is about a man named Joey Green. And Joey Green is returning to Beaumont, North Carolina, because his father has dementia, and he's rapidly losing most of his memory. So he comes at a time when Marshall, his father, short-term memory is practically non-existent, but his long-term memory is very good. However, strange things start to happen, and this is where a mystery comes in. Marshall will think that he sees people from the past, and he will talk to them. And Joey will stop and watch this, but not interrupt him. However, because his memory of the past is so good, he actually says something that he has committed a murder. Now, of course, Joey doesn't want anyone to know this, but we'll have to find out what happens. And you'll agree with William Kent Kruger. I loved this book. The next book we have is called Fathers, Sons, and Holy Ghosts of Baseball, written by Tommy Murray. Tommy Murray lives in Shoreview, and he taught in the Minneapolis Public Schools for many years. His story traces the story of his uncle, Tommy, from which he got his name. Now, it takes place in a small Iowa town, and it's heartwarming. It feels good. It's got wonderful characters. And let me tell you a little bit about them. That for years there have been 3 elderly men who have been the coaches of the high school baseball team. And, well, they are rather crotchety. And this is going to be their last year coaching. And they desperately want to win the championship title. So that's the basis of the story. But when you come back and look at the characters, you'll see how well they're developed, how much they care about each other, how much a town supports them. And you'll have to read the book to find out if they do win that championship. Now, in Minnesota, I could not forget about books about the lake. I mean, it's part of our culture. And here's a lovely children's book called My Little Cabin by Alice Palace. Isn't that fun? Alice Palace. And it tells a story, of course, about going up to her grandma's cabin. And it's just a wonderful, darling adventure. And I paired it with a book for adults. This one is called Vacation Land by Sarah Stonich. This is probably her most popular and well-known book. And she did win a Minnesota Book Award for this book. It happens towards the end of the time when the resorts that were mom and pop were starting to grow fewer. And the bigger resorts were taking up almost all the tourists. So Meg, the protagonist in this story, comes to help out her grandfather, as she has been doing many years, to help at this resort. And this book tells about the many people that come to the resort year after year after year. They've got stories to tell, and of course, if you've ever been to a resort where you've been visiting with people that you've gone back to and shared those experiences each year, you'll understand all the things that happen. Some of the things are funny that happen in the story. Some of the stories are bittersweet. Some are surprising. But it's an excellent book. Vacation Land by Sarah Stonich. Now, I'm going to begin with a book called How to Talk Minnesotan. Now, the How to Talk Minnesotan is written by Howard Moore. And when Howard Moore was a part of the cast of Lake Wobegon, he made what was called a Minnesota language system, so that people from out of state, could understand what the natives were talking about. And he also, this book became a recommended reading in a class at the University of Minnesota that won awards. And this class was called MSL, Minnesota as a Second Language. Now, hordes of tourists every year, especially in the summer, would flock to Minnesota to fish on one of our 10,000 lakes. And this book was always found in each cabin. It was a rare event for a resort not to have this book in a cabin, because it could be well used. In fact, many were tattered just for helping people to learn Minnesotan language. And Minnesota companies who were hiring people out of state would always insert this book into their new employee packages. And it was especially helpful because who knows how long those new employees would have been floundering if it hadn't been for the valuable guide in this book. I'd like to read you a part of the dedication to this book. It is written by J.D. and June Grady, and they happen to be Minnesota marriage counselors, and they have nothing but good to say about this book and how it helps struggling marriages. Marriage counselors in Minnesota frequently deal with USOs, unions on the skids, where women from such exotic areas come from like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta, marry a Minnesota man, and within a few months they're throwing up their hands in frustration. Counselors have found that the union can be saved if the wife is given a copy of How to Talk Minnesotan. The Minnesota man is truly a complex species. Oh, nice enough, guys. Men in a truly complex species who really try to do their best to be better. Not that they're all that bad. We have seen no other book that is so helpful to our main clientele. In fact, I should insert here that my son-in-law just became an American citizen in February. And to celebrate his citizenship, I knew he needed a copy of this book, to up his communication skills. Now, in order to talk Minnesotan, there are different phrases that one needs to know, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about 3 different phrases. The first one is, you bet. And you bet is a thank you, upbeat message from a Minnesotan. The second one is, that's different, which is kind of in between. I'm not sure if Minnesotan would think, I'm not sure I agree with that, but I'm not going to say anything. And the last word is called whatever, and that's an expression of disappointment. For example, if you are in the grocery store and the cashier asks you, did you find anything? Everything that you needed? And a Minnesotan would answer, you bet. Thank you. And the cashier would smile back and say, you bet. Now, you might be talking fishing sometime with a Minnesotan. You might say, I think I'm going to bring some night crawlers to fish with. What are you going to use? Oh, I'm going to use stink bait, he says. Raw hamburger mixed with moldy cheese and binded with oatmeal. And you say, oh, okay, whatever. And then or they would say, that's different. And then another thing is, maybe one day your employer would walk up to you and say, well, Bud, you really are doing a great job. I can't complain, but I have to let you go. It's the economy. And you say, whatever. However, let's give you a test on using those 3 words. Now, let's pretend that your wife comes up to you and says, oh, dear, my sister and brother-in-law are coming to visit us for a few months while they're trying to find their way. And if you really enjoy your relatives, you might say, you bet. If you're not so sure, you say, oh, that's different. But you'd probably say, whatever. Now, in Minnesota, there are lots of things to do. And probably the top activity would be fishing on a wonderful Minnesota lake. The second top tourist activity is sitting on the shore, thinking about fishing while enjoying a cold beer in the shade. And the third fun, interesting thing to do is to go to pageants. Oh, there are pageants all over Minnesota. So the most exciting pageant I have found is by the Academy of Handy Persons. Now, on February 2nd, usually, if it's a Saturday, the first Saturday in February, you can visit the pageant and the competition of all those Minnesota handy people. You'll see people coming out of their trucks with saws and all kinds of tools and big backpacks of tools and screws and flannel shirts and caps, and they're all ready to go to work and to enter this exciting contest. Well, one time I visited, here's what happened during the contest time. Now, here are some best handy ideas that came up during this one contest. The nominees were Teddy Nichols for extending the life of an egg carton with varnish. The second one was Irene Fields, a spice shelf organizational plan. And Bud Bauman for patching old overshoes. And Bud won the top ribbon for patching those old overshoes. The second thing is that they also give a prize and ribbons for the most amazing single handy act. The nominees that year were Ephra Glenwood. He was repairing and replacing a ball valve float assembled in a toilet tank without shutting off the water. Ephra told the audience that the secret was long rubber gloves and making sure that your tools are greased. The second prize went to Mike Mickelson, reducing refrigerator odor with a simple device made with a food blender and 2 feet of garden hose. And the winning prize was Leo Rossberger. He was jump-started his car in a blizzard with static electricity from his wife's raccoon coat. And here is Creative Recycling Award. Henry in Richmond made a studio couch made out of chunks of tires, truck tires that he found along the highway. Dee Dee Whalen made a revolving doghouse from a discarded washing machine. And Henry H. Holtrow, the winning entry, made a typewriter paper from old clothes. Oh, my goodness, he must have been very creative. And then the best overall performance went to nominees Bob Bart and Bernie Bogan for group insulation, Roger and Edna Abbott and his son Grady for group carpeting. But the Flying Sheetrockers, 4 neighbors from Ortonville, stole the show that year when they demonstrated their art on a bare 8 by 24 foot wall. They measured, cut, and installed all that sheetrock in less than 3 minutes. I wish the people that would come to my house to do repairs could work so quickly. And I paired this children's book with How to Talk Minnesotan. Now, Minnesotan is not a musical language. In fact, people have known to compare it to a guitar with 1 string. You know, this monotone. Now, this book is called Moo, and it's written by David La Rochelle, Minnesota resident, who, I think was 2013, won the Minnesota Book Award. And it happens to be only 1 word, which means that the book, How to Talk Minnesotan, you know how it is. They don't say too much. And David La Rochelle, just 1 word. Well, that made me think that they made a good pair, these 2 books. However, when you open up the book, and you'll see the cow, it says moo. Oh, moo. Moo? Moo! Car for sale. Moo! 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 Moo, moo. Moo! Moo, 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 moo. Oh, I wonder what happened to the car. Moo! Well, if you want your children to learn a little inflection, you know, not always talking like a one-string guitar, this will be the perfect introduction for them to learn how to speak with some excitement. In fact, it took me quite a long time to practice this, but it will help you in your later years to kind of smooth out that and make your talking just a little bit more exciting. And I wonder why is that perhaps the television programs don't actually have many Minnesotan people, you know, representing on their shows, like Jeopardy, where they jump up and down. I'm not sure Minnesotan would do that. This is a nonfiction book called From the Gridiron to the Battlefield. It happens to be the story of the Gopher football team, 1941, when they won the Heisman Trophy. It's written by Jerry Spacek, and Mr. Spacek was a television reporter in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and his grandfather, Jack, was on the Gopher team, and then he served in World War II in the South Pacific in the Army Air Corps. It's a story of the greatest generation. It begins with, in December 9th, the whole country was gathering around the radios, ready to listen to FDR give his first fireside chat since the invasion of Pearl Harbor. There was also another person that was going on the radio. His name was Bruce Smith. Bruce Smith was the captain of the Minnesota Gopher football team, and he had to give a speech of acceptance for Minnesota and for himself of the Heisman Trophy. Now, Mr. Smith, Boo, they called him Bruce Smith, his name was Boo, was getting ready to present his speech about 15 minutes before the president was to speak. And he got up and he said that the team was undefeated. He was very proud. But he said, you know, we're not going to just leave our country because it looks like now our country is going to need help. And I promise you, said Boo, that soon we will take off our football uniforms and put on military ones. And that's exactly what they did. Most of the book is about those last few games of the season where they continued to be undefeated. But the end of the book are the legacies of the men that were on this team and how each one of them gave their part in World War II. It's uplifting and it's a wonderful story. Now, you know Minnesota has lots of things to see and do, when you can get off your fishing boat, that is. And one of the favorite places is so dear to us is Split Rock Lighthouse. Well, this man, Lee Radzik, just about 2 years ago, retired from being the lighthouse keeper. He was the lighthouse keeper for 34 years. And he loved his job. He was very well thought of. He lived with his family, a wife, a son and a daughter, and a dog. And this book is written in seasons. So he tells activities that they did in spring, summer, winter, fall. You know, I've always found that lighthouse stories are captivating, almost romantic. I mean, when you think about the lighthouse, you think of this fog, and you think of how, oh, you know, you can't see in the fog, and where are the people in that boat? And they have a big celebration for the Edmund Fitzgerald. And every year they talk about that. And it's a great, great festival to attend. Now, I have a story I paired with also. Actually, it's a children's story written by Margie Prius. Margie also is a Minnesota author. And her story is an historical story about a family that lived by the lighthouse. And what the story is about is that Sophie, the little girl, can tell when there's a storm coming. The sky changes, the smell in the air changes, and she goes around to tell all the people in her family, storm's coming, storm's coming. She tells her mother, her father, her brothers, her sister, and they all come in together to make sure that they do not get hurt. And there's Sister picking blueberries. It looks nice enough, but Sophie knows storm is coming. This story happens to be a similar story that has been reenacted many times, and Lee Ratzik's family has lived and through many storms. It's a beautiful book, beautiful pictures, and a good story to read with your child. The last book I have today is called Wishing for a Snow Day, written by Peg Meyer. Peg Meyer was a journalist for the Minneapolis Star for many, many years. She is very famous for writing books about history and Minnesota culture. You might be familiar with a couple of her other books. One is titled Too Hot, Going to the Lake, and another one is titled Bring Warm Clothes. Well, this happens to be my favorite Peg Meyer book. She has collected stories from diaries, letters that children wrote. It tells about bittersweet memories that shares. She went through hundreds and hundreds of photographs, and she put them together in this delightful book. I'm going to read some of the stories to you so that you'll get an idea what this book is really like. And I'll be showing you a picture as I read the story. We're going to begin with an entry from July 4th from a boy named Frederick Alice. Now, we think that the 4th of July can get out of hand. Well, listen to what happened on this 4th of July picnic at a Methodist church. July 7th, 1861. On the 4th of July, I went to the Methodist church, probably in St. Paul. There, girls were boys versus boys threw firecrackers at each other after refreshments, during which many holes were burnt in each other's clothing. I got behind a tree of 5 girls who were doing the most damage to the boys so they wouldn't see me. I kept tossing into them, busting under and over them. I burnt about a dozen holes in the dress of one of them. After a while, the girls stopped, partly for the want of firecrackers and torpedoes, and partly on account of holes and burns. One boy had a blister on the back of his neck. I had 4 small holes in my clothes. Just before refreshments, the Declaration of Independence was read, and in the evening we fired off skyrockets, 6 serpents, 5 pinwheels, 1 grasshopper, and during the day, 12 packs of firecrackers and 6 packs of tornadoes. And I have a picture here of Jewel Anderson. Now, looking at Jewel Anderson, she looks beautiful, all fixed up for 4th of July. I kind of get the idea that she was not at that picnic. Now, here's a story about a Christmas that goes bad. The Christmas I remember most of all was when we ate Petrus, our goose. She had come to our farm near Aurora as a gosling. Thinking she was a gander, we named her Pete. But when she laid an egg, we named her Petrus. She always followed me around the farm, Daffy crooning to me, and I could never sit down without her getting into my lap and resting her head on my neck. She also wanted to mother the puppies. And when our Cocker Spaniel, Flicka, left her babies unattended once, Petrus nestled on them. She outspread her wings, her crazy eyes softened, and she was very maternal. But what a hoo-ha there was when Flicka discovered Petrus was gabbing there. The puppies didn't mind, but Flicka went mad. Foaming at the mouth, she attacked Petrus and did her best to fly, but weighing 20 pounds, all Petrus could do was lollop away, flapping her wings, while Flicka helped her along by grabbing mouthfuls of her rump and feathers. At last, poor Petrus ran headlong for the doghouse and stuck fast in the doorway, her fanny exposed, her cries dreadful, as Flicka lay down and promptly began denuding the plump backside. I scolded Flicka away and pityingly hauled Petrus feet first out of the doghouse. When Christmas came and Petrus lay wreathed with parsley on the platter, I could not touch a drumstick. I couldn't lay a fork on her white meat. I could not eat it all. Cranberry sauce sparkled. Sweet potatoes swam in golden sauce. Apple pie bubbled and crisped. But to no avail. I just sat pea-green at the table, poised on the edge of my chair, brittle tears ready to break down my face. They had Petrus for Christmas dinner. This was written by Shirley Schoonover, 1940s. Now, the picture I have to go again with this particular book happens to be about in 1945, and maybe some of you remember this. Western look was very dominant, and the kids loved to dress in Western uniforms. Here we see in 1951 Mike and Henry Sieben in their new Hopalong Cassidy in outfits. Hopalong was a star of the first Northwestern television station, and he was on everything from wristwatches to lunchboxes. Oh, and by the way, these Sieben boys went on to fame in the Minnesota legislature. Must have been that good beginning that they had. Now I know that you're going to remember the polio epidemic in the 1940s. Here's a letter from Charles Martin written to dear Sister Kenny, March 13th, 1944. Dear Sister Kenny, I am now a perfect, normal 16-year-old boy with the ambition to become an actor and a singer. And I hope that someday I will succeed as you have in your great work. I remember that little boy next to me in the hospital sometimes. He was never to walk again. Then I feel wonderful because at last we have someone in the world to cure this disease that has wrecked so many lives. I know now that it wasn't a miracle, like the doctor said, that healed me. It was the magic touch of God massaging my legs. Yours most respectfully, Charles Martin. And in this picture, you will see Sister Kenny massaging a boy's legs. But to end on a happier note, we have an exuberant patient named Peter F. Schroeder. He demonstrated his dexterity to his mother Ruth in their St. Cloud home in 1948. He had been treated successfully for polio at the Kenny Institute. And the last story and picture I have has to do with romance. This is actually in the Growing Up chapter of Peg Meyer's book. Here's an entrance. Yeah, it doesn't have a name or a date, but it tells about a romantic endeavor. Sunday, January 9th. Last night, I went skating at the University Club. He was there. I was wearing my red jacket and cap. I was practicing my figure eights. And I didn't know how to do them very well when he came skating up to me. He said, "You look like Red Riding Hood, and you know what happened to her. The wolf came and ate her up." And then he made a horrible face at me. He tried to catch her first. He kept skating after her. I was skating so fast as I could, and of course, he caught me being good at hockey. He grabbed me around the waist, and I thought he was going to kiss me. But I decided I didn't know whether I should let him. He didn't, though. He pushed away and skated fast around anything, and he left off. Showing off, I guess he was, but it was all very romantic. Speaking of romance, we have Maud Kite and Gordon Coaster in this picture in 1921. They seem to be stuck more on each other than on the Brinker book that they were reading. And that's called a rolling hoop that you see in the picture, not a hula hoop of later generations. Thank you for visiting with Welcome Word. I have one more shout out that I'd like to make, and that is we talked about how there are so many independent booksellers in Minnesota. Well, we have a terrific bookseller right down on the main street of Hopkins called Cream and Amber. Their store is delightful. The choice of books are phenomenal, and I've been ordering many books for Welcome Word through Cream and Amber. They even have snacks and light sandwiches and light breakfasts that you can enjoy while you're perusing for a new book. Visit them. That's Cream and Amber, Main Street on Hopkins. Thank you. I enjoyed this today, and I hope I will see you again soon.